Hey guys, me again. I hope you're all well. So basically, yes, I'm going to be reading The Great Gatsby. We're going to read chapter 1. As you're reading, guys, keep in mind, take a look at the vocabulary assignment that I posted. So for each week, you guys are going to have to be looking for 10 vocabulary words, keeping them in a document, and you're going to be graded on this. So basically, in your document, you're going to have to follow the format, the example that I gave you, on the vocabulary assignment, but basically you have to include the word, you have to include the quote from which it came in the text, the page number, as well as the definition and the type of word that it is, okay? So make sure that you're, take note of the words as you're reading and the page number. Maybe, I know most of you are probably reading from a PDF if you don't have the book, but, highlight or just take note of it as you're reading, and then take note of the page on the PDF and then look it up after. Or I think you can highlight also on PDF, so keep that in mind. This is going to be due at the beginning of not next class because we won't have finished chapter 1, but at the beginning of the next class of next week. So it'll be, your vocabulary list for that week will be due on the following class that we're done the chapter, okay? You'll get the hang of it. So basically, as I mentioned in the previous video, even though the title is called The Great Gatsby and this book is about Jay Gatsby, our main character's name is actually Nick Carraway. So he's our narrator, and it is in the first person. So we're going to be seeing Gatsby's life through Nick Carraway's perspective, alright? So we're going to learn about the different social classes. We're introduced to most of our main characters. We're not introduced to Gatsby right away in chapter 1, but we do get to hear about him from Gatsby and from Nick Carraway and from the other characters as well. So if you want to listen to me reading, amazing. If you want to read on your own, amazing too. Totally up to you. If you just miss the sound of my voice and want to hear me reading, then stay tuned. So chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college. I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. So here he's talking about how he's had so many advantages in his own upbringing, and he's basically, this last line really stands out to me. He's saying basically that there are fundamental decencies parceled out unequally at birth. So people are born with certain advantages and disadvantages, and these categories of, being in an advantage or a disadvantage is given to you at birth. You're born into your social class. So yes, there are people who, are born poor and become rich, and that's amazing, but oftentimes you're born in the class that you will live out the rest of your life, which is basically what he's saying. We're born into it. It's not something that we necessarily get to choose. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. So he wanted a more calm life. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. So he's talking about Gatsby, and he's saying that even though Gatsby's exempt from this, he is saying that Gatsby represents to Nick all of the things that he hates, all of the things that he doesn't see right in the world. Even though he himself, Gatsby, is exempt from that judgment from Nick. We'll see why. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So here he's talking about, that Gatsby, he's saying Gatsby, and I want you guys to take note of this paragraph because you will have to, talk about, Gatsby's first introduction, even though he's not actually physically introduced here, he's talked about. And here, Nick is saying, Gatsby turned out all right, but it's what preyed on Gatsby. This is what caused the scorn that he feels for this class of people. So I want you guys to think about even what literary device is being used here in these words, in this last little part of this paragraph. Think about it. So you can kind of see that this is actually, right now, he's talking in the present tense, and everything else in this book is actually a flashback. So now, he's looking back on his time with Gatsby and his time, and we're going to see, how his relationship with Gatsby develops, but this is actually a flashback from this point forward. So we're going kind of back in time, and we're going to see why he developed a scorn for this type of people besides Gatsby, and what is it exactly that preyed on Gatsby. Okay? Let's keep reading. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in the delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raids so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody knew I was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east, permanently. I thought in the spring of 22. So our setting is 1922. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was warm season and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days, until he ran away. and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning, some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. So here, again, this book is separated between social classes, and we see the different social classes in the novel, and they are portrayed in this novel as West Egg, East Egg, and Valley of Ashes. Although we're not introduced to the Valley of Ashes in this chapter, I want you to really take note and highlight when he talks about West Egg and East Egg and how he describes him, because you're going to have to figure out which social class is which and how they're portrayed in this novel, okay? There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year, I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life, and become again that the most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. So here's where he's describing the two eggs. 20 miles from the city, from New York City. A pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, just out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. We're going to talk about that illusion. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hôtel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. So he lives in West Egg, and he has Gatsby's, but he's between two mansions. So he's saying that West Egg is the less fashionable of the two if you're looking at it from a superficial perspective. But he's saying that the house next to him, looked like an Hôtel de Ville in Normandy. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like when we analyze the chapter a little bit. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on that evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. So here he's talking about how West Egg and East Egg, they're separated by a bay of water. And from West Egg, from his porch, he can see on the other side of that bay is East Egg, so he can see the houses there. So he's saying that the story of that summer starts this evening when he visits the Tom Buchanans in East Egg. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. So he's going to visit the Buchanans. So Daisy is the wife, and Daisy Buchanan is his cousin. Tom is her husband. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east, in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the phone. But I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened, on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see 2 old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sunjils and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines, as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. 2 shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre deep of pungent roses, and a snob-nosed motor boat that bumped the tide offshore. Sorry, guys. Okay. It belonged to Demen, the oil man. He turned me around again politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which 2 young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows and the caught wind died out by the room. And the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came forward into the room. "I'm paralyzed with happiness," she laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little, and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore." "How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." Then she added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to." "She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's—" Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bondman." "Who with?" I told him. "Never heard of him," he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I answered shortly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. "I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." At this point, Miss Baker said, "Absolutely," with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room. So we're going to stop here for now. So basically, we've been introduced to, we've been introduced to Nick, we've been introduced to the Buchanans, Tom and Daisy, and we've also been introduced to a woman, we don't really know what she's about, Jordan Baker. So we're going to learn a little bit more about her too. And basically, we know that he is related to the Buchanans, although he doesn't have as much money as them. We can kind of see a little bit into their characters. So there's, like Daisy, they're very lazy people. She doesn't even want to get up to greet her cousin. The other one, Jordan Baker, doesn't utter a word. Yet, they're all about, what they're going to do next. So they are probably, you can get a sense of the type of characters that they have. Daisy's like, we're going to go back to Chicago tomorrow if we want. They're very kind of go with the flow type of people, although Tom seems to be a little against that. Please take note of the page on the PDF because we are going to continue reading it next class. In the next video, we're going to kind of go through that PowerPoint that we were introduced to a little bit more in terms of what we've seen so far in... No, actually, sorry guys, we're not going to look at the PowerPoint today. What I would like you to do for the rest of class I've assigned you guys, so you do have a little bit of a description of the two eggs, West egg and East egg, from what you've read so far in the chapter. And this is really important that you kind of understand which egg is which social class is represented in West egg, which social class is represented in East egg. So you guys are going to take a look at, there is a Google Doc, it's an assignment, East egg, West egg. And you're gonna go back in what you just read, and I really want you to describe both eggs. Describe what's going on in East egg, what's going on in West egg, and what you think the social class is in each. Which are they representative of, okay? That's your task for the rest of class. You have to submit it by the end of class. Next class, we are going to finish the chapter and discuss what's going on. If you have any questions, please let me know. But your job today for the rest of class is just to fill out that Google Doc about the two eggs so you can know which one's which, okay? I hope you enjoyed listening to me read, and I will see you guys on the chat, okay?